For decades, the story of Jeffrey Epstein was this mix of incredible wealth, power, and these really dark rumors. But after his death, the real story, the one that matters, started to come out. And not from headlines, but from thousands and thousands of pages of sealed documents. You see, this isn't just about one man. It's an investigation into a whole system. And today, we're unlocking the files. For years, this is basically what the public, what investigators, and most importantly, what victims faced when they tried to understand the true scale of Epstein's criminal world. The truth was just locked away, sealed up in court records and confidential files. But that lock, well, it's finally been picked. So let's start with the central mystery itself, the Epstein Files. We hear that phrase all the time, right? But what exactly are these files, and why has their release become such a massive and, let's be honest, such a controversial event? So what are we actually talking about when we say the Epstein Files? Because it's not some single, neat little black book or a client list. Nope. It's something way more sprawling, way more complex than that. I mean, just look at the sheer scale of this. We are talking about a massive collection of information. You've got transcripts from these harrowing interviews with victims and witnesses, items seized from raids on his different homes, and according to the Department of Justice, over 300 gigabytes of data. That's huge. Plus, it pulls in documents from the investigation into his main accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, and a bunch of civil lawsuits. It's truly a mountain of evidence.
So why now, you might be wondering? Well, this wasn't some voluntary decision. There was intense political and public pressure that led to something called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. It was a law passed by Congress and signed in November 2025 that basically forced the Department of Justice to open up its archives.
But here is the critical point, the big catch. It's not a total data dump. The law has some pretty significant exceptions. The Attorney General can still hold back information that's tied to active cases, anything that identifies victims, of course, graphic material, and, this one is a really big one, anything that's considered an unwarranted invasion of personal privacy. And that right there creates this huge gray area that's at the heart of the whole controversy. Okay, so now that we have a sense of what the files are, let's dig into what they actually tell us. We're going to go from the mystery of the documents to the mechanics of the actual crime they describe. This is where we break down the modus operandi of Epstein's trafficking ring. You know, a huge portion of what we now know comes not from a criminal trial, but from civil lawsuits. Especially this one, Virginia Giuffre versus Ghislaine Maxwell. This case really became the legal crowbar that pried open so many of these sealed documents, and it revealed the inner workings of the abuse from the people who actually survived it. This is where you start to see the coded, sinister language of the whole operation. The word massage, that was the central euphemism. As this court filing says, it was the cover for sexual acts. It was the word they used to lure people in, to deceive them, and to try and normalize horrific abuse, with Ghislaine Maxwell named as the primary recruiter. And this quote, I mean, it's taken directly from court documents, and it's just chillingly specific. It shows you how they used a peer-to-peer recruitment model. A 15 or 16-year-old girl is offered $300 for a massage. It wasn't just a crime, it was a business model, and it was built on exploiting vulnerable children. So the files, they lay out this really clear, systematic process. It starts with identifying vulnerable girls. Then comes the offer, money, work, the promise of a better life. Maxwell and others would act as these trusted go-betweens. And finally, the victims were moved around between Epstein's properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and his private island. The documents are just filled with deposition questions exactly like this one. You can see the lawyers methodically trying to cut through all the denials to expose the truth. And that focus on under the age of 18 is just relentless through all the legal papers because, well, that was the absolute core of this criminal enterprise. All right, let's zoom out a bit. We're going to widen our lens to look at the web of power because these files, they aren't just about Epstein and Maxwell. They're about the powerful network that insulated them and, in some cases, allegedly participated in their world. And this, of course, is what generates all the headlines. The documents mention a really wide range of prominent figures. You see their names pop up in depositions, flight logs, and contact books. We're talking former presidents like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, royalty like Prince Andrew, and a whole host of other well-known names from science, business, and entertainment.
Okay, so we have to pause here because this is absolutely critically important. We have to be crystal clear. Just like journalists at the BBC and the Wall Street Journal have said over and over, being named in these documents is not, I repeat, not evidence of wrongdoing. It just means a person's name appeared in some context, maybe on a flight log, in an email, or in testimony, somewhere within this massive investigation.
However, the files do contain some very specific and, well, very troubling testimony. For instance, this is a direct quote from a deposition where a witness, Johanna Sjoberg, recalls a comment that Epstein allegedly made about former President Bill Clinton. This is presented as one person's sworn testimony, just one piece of this giant, awful puzzle.
And then you have another really concrete example. This excerpt from a deposition discusses that infamous photograph of Prince Andrew with his arm around a then 17-year-old Virginia Giuffre with Ghislaine Maxwell right there in the background. The testimony here isn't just about the photo existing, but about the victim being paid for it, which connects a powerful person directly to the financial side of this world.
So this all leads us right into our fourth section, a flawed reckoning. Because let's be honest, the whole reason these files are being released now is because of this widespread belief that for decades, justice in this case was either denied or, at the very least, seriously delayed. This timeline really tells a story of contrasts, doesn't it? Back in 2008, Epstein gets what many people call a sweetheart deal, just 18 months for state crimes, which shielded him from much more serious federal charges. Then, a decade later, he's finally arrested again, but dies before he can even face trial. Ghislaine Maxwell, on the other hand, is convicted and is now serving a 20-year sentence. And what is just staggering is how long authorities knew about the scale of all this. By 2005, that's a full 3 years before that lenient plea deal, the FBI had already identified at least 35 girls with similar horrible stories of being abused by Epstein. The alarm bells were ringing loud and clear. So Epstein's death in 2019 meant he would never face a jury. And for so many of his victims and for the public, this made the fight to get these files released even more critical. It became one of the last ways to get any kind of public accountability and to really understand his network. And that brings us to our final section, what the files reveal. With thousands of pages now out in the open, what have we actually learned? And what have been the consequences of all this transparency? Let's break it down. Look, we already knew Epstein was a sex trafficker. What the files have done is confirm, in just excruciating detail, the sheer scale of his operation, the specific ways he recruited and abused people, and the undeniable closeness of some of the world's most powerful people. But because of all those redactions we talked about, what we still don't know is the full, unvarnished list of everyone who might have been involved. But this push for transparency has had a really devastating side effect. Despite all the legal protections that were supposed to be in place, a review by the Wall Street Journal found that the names of at least 43 victims were accidentally exposed in these document releases. In the rush to expose perpetrators, survivors have been re-traumatized, and that's just a tragic, unacceptable consequence. So we're left with this really difficult question. The files have peeled back another layer of a truly horrific story, but they're not the complete picture. They give us details, but not always definitive answers. And it forces us to ask, when transparency is flawed and when justice for the main person responsible is impossible, what does accountability actually look like? And who is it really for? That's the question these files leave